The moment Ali Khamenei's heart stopped beating, a clock started ticking that nobody wants you to see. On March the 1st, 2026, American and Israeli forces didn't just eliminate a dictator. They cracked open a power vacuum that three nations have spent decades preparing to fill. Washington is already spinning this as a victory for democracy. Tel Aviv calls it self-defense, but here's what neither government will tell you. Khamenei's death was never the endgame. It was the opening move. Right now, inside Iran's Revolutionary Guard headquarters, generals are making phone calls that will determine whether 88 million people wake up to civil war or something far worse. In Beijing, officials are reviewing contracts worth hundreds of billions, and in Moscow, Putin is smiling because he's seen this playbook before. The question isn't who killed Khamenei. The question is who inherits the empire he built, who controls Iran's nuclear program now, and which superpower already has their puppet waiting in the wings, because someone is about to get very, very rich, and someone is about to get very, very dead. This is the story they don't want told. The Supreme Leader's body isn't even cold and already the knives are out. In Tehran, Revolutionary Guard commanders are seizing television stations, not to mourn, but to control the narrative. 3 separate factions within the IRGC are claiming provisional authority. None of them are talking to each other. All of them are armed. Brent crude just spiked $47 in 6 hours. The Strait of Hormuz shipping lanes are emptying. Lloyd's of London has suspended all maritime insurance for the Persian Gulf. But here's what the cable news anchors are getting catastrophically wrong. They keep asking who pulled the trigger, who ordered the strike. Was it Mossad, CIA, internal rivals? That's the wrong question. The right question is this. Who spent the last decade ensuring that when Khamenei finally fell, there would be no succession plan? Who systematically eliminated every potential heir, every moderate voice, every institutional safeguard that could have held the Islamic Republic together? Because this isn't an assassination. This is a controlled demolition, and the architects aren't the ones holding the detonator. They're the ones who removed all the exits from the building. But here's what nobody's asking. Forget the how, forget the who. The only question that matters is this. Who benefits? Because when a supreme leader dies, he doesn't just leave behind a country. He leaves behind a vacuum, a black hole of power that sucks in everyone with something to gain. And right now, 3 players are circling that vacuum like sharks smelling blood. First, the American military-industrial complex. Defense contractors who've watched Iran tensions simmer for decades, waiting for the pot to finally boil over. A destabilized Iran means new deployments, new weapons contracts, new billions flowing into the machine. Second, Israeli expansionist factions. The hardliners who've argued for years that diplomacy is dead, that the only path forward runs through Tehran's ashes. Khamenei's death isn't a tragedy to them, it's an opportunity. But the third beneficiary, this is where it gets interesting. Because they're not in Washington, they're not in Tel Aviv, they're inside Iran itself. Hidden within the Revolutionary Guard. A faction so patient, so calculating, they've been waiting for this moment for 20 years. Every empire that's ever fallen started with a single question. What happens when the head is removed? This isn't about Iran. Not really. This is about a strategy so effective, so devastatingly precise, that civilizations have been using it for over 2,000 years. The Romans perfected it. When they couldn't defeat an enemy through brute force, they didn't waste legions. They waited. They watched. And when the moment came, they struck at one person. Just one. The Persians themselves used it. The Mongols weaponized it. The British Empire built their entire colonial strategy around it. Decapitation warfare. You don't destroy the body, you sever the head and watch the body destroy itself. And here's what makes this moment different from every history book you've ever read. We're not looking backward to understand the past. We're looking backward to understand tomorrow. Because the same forces that toppled Rome's greatest enemies, that shattered dynasties across 3 continents, are in motion right now. The players have changed. The playbook hasn't. To understand who benefits from Khamenei's death, we have to go back, way back. The year is 129 CE. Roman Emperor Hadrian faces a problem. The Parthian Empire blocks his eastern ambitions, and its king, Osroes, has unified the fractured nobility. So Hadrian doesn't invade, he doesn't siege cities or march legions across the desert. Instead, he sends a different kind of weapon. Assassins. When Osrhoes falls, Rome doesn't claim a single inch of Parthian territory. They don't need to, because what follows is exactly what Hadrian wanted. Chaos. Parthian princes turn on each other. Generals declare themselves king. For 10 years, the empire bleeds from within, while Roman merchants, diplomats, and spies creep steadily eastward, filling every vacuum the civil war creates. This is the template. This is how great powers have operated for 2,000 years. You don't destroy your enemy, you decapitate their leadership and let their own ambitions tear them apart. The question isn't whether this playbook still exists. It's whether someone just used it on Iran. Because when a supreme leader dies and succession becomes uncertain, history tells us exactly who benefits, whoever was patient enough to wait. The Romans perfected it, the British refined it, and every intelligence agency on Earth still practices it today. The decapitation doctrine. Kill the head and the body doesn't die. It transforms. See, amateurs think assassination is about elimination. Professionals know it's about architecture. You remove the keystone not to collapse the arch, but to rebuild it in a shape that serves you better. When the CIA helped topple Mossadegh in 1953, they didn't want to destroy Iran. They wanted an Iran that opened its oil fields to Western contracts. When colonial powers executed tribal leaders across Africa, they didn't want empty land. They wanted compliant successors who understood the new arrangement. The target is never really the man, it's the system he holds together. A supreme leader isn't just a person, he's a living constitution, a theological anchor, a veto point over every major decision. Remove him, and suddenly everything becomes negotiable. Factions that were frozen in place start moving. Alliances that seemed permanent become flexible. The goal was never destruction. It was always transformation into something more useful. 1953, Tehran. The playbook was written right here. Mohammad Mossadegh made one mistake. He nationalized Iranian oil. Within months, the CIA and British intelligence launched Operation Ajax, not an assassination, something far more elegant. They didn't need to kill Mossadegh, they needed to remove him. Paid mobs flooded the streets. Newspapers they controlled screamed about communist takeover. Religious leaders they'd bribed called him an enemy of Islam. The chaos wasn't organic, it was manufactured hour by hour until the moment was perfect. Then the Shah stepped in, their Shah, a 25-year-old puppet who'd fled to Rome days earlier, suddenly returning as saviour. The pattern crystallized that summer. Create the crisis, control the narrative, own the transition, install your man. For 26 years, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi served Western interests while his secret police tortured dissidents in basement cells. The Iranian people never forgot who put him there. This is the template. This is what regime change actually looks like when professionals run it. And 70 years later, the same agencies are watching Tehran again. The Americans celebrated in 1953. They'd installed their man, secured their oil, contained the Soviets. Mission accomplished. But they'd also done something else. They'd humiliated an entire nation. They'd proven that democracy meant nothing when it threatened Western interests, and they'd radicalized a generation. Among them, a young seminary student in Mashhad named Ali Khamenei. He watched his country become a puppet state. He watched the Shah's secret police torture dissidents with CIA training. He watched American advisors live like kings while Iranians starved. 26 years later, that student helped lead a revolution that burned American flags and took American hostages. The Islamic Republic wasn't born from Islam alone. It was born from fury at foreign interference. This is the blowback principle. Every covert action creates consequences its architects never imagined. The men who overthrew Mossadegh couldn't conceive they were creating their own worst enemy. And now, Washington debates removing Khamenei using the same playbook that created him. The strategy that built the problem is being proposed as the solution. The desert road outside Baghdad International Airport, January 3, 2020. 3 missiles from an MQ-9 Reaper turned Qasem Soleimani into a memory. But here's what most people missed. This wasn't just an assassination, it was an experiment. The most powerful military commander in the Middle East, architect of Iran's entire proxy network, the man who had humiliated American forces across 4 countries, vaporized in seconds, and Washington watched, waited, measured. Iran's response? Ballistic missiles fired at Al-Assad airbase with advance warning. Choreographed retaliation designed to save face without triggering escalation. No American deaths, no second strike. The Pentagon learned something invaluable that night. Iran's deterrence doctrine has a ceiling. They'll bluster, they'll threaten, but when you remove their most irreplaceable asset, they calculate rather than escalate. Soleimani was supposed to be untouchable. The red line no one would cross, and when America crossed it anyway, Tehran blinked. That data point sits in planning documents right now. The question isn't whether decapitation works against the Iranian system. The question is how high you can aim. The Soleimani strike was more than an assassination. It was a test. Washington watched Tehran's response with clinical precision. The ballistic missiles that rained down on Al-Assad airbase looked devastating on camera. But here's what the intelligence community noticed. Iran warned Iraq. Iraq warned America. No American died that night. That was the tell. Iran's retaliation was theatre, designed for domestic consumption, while avoiding the one thing the regime fears above all else: a war it cannot win. The Revolutionary Guard leadership understood a fundamental truth. Escalation means extinction. American strategists took notes. They catalogued every restrained response, every diplomatic back channel, every moment Tehran chose survival over honor. A pattern emerged. Iran would bluster, Iran would threaten, but Iran would not cross the line that invited American military might into their borders. This intelligence didn't gather dust in some Pentagon filing cabinet. It became operational doctrine. If Iran wouldn't escalate over their most beloved general, their most valuable strategic asset, then perhaps they wouldn't escalate over something even bigger. The calculations had already begun. The ultimate target was no longer unthinkable. The timing wasn't luck, it was surgical. Khamenei at 86, health failing, succession plans murky at best. Behind closed doors, RGZ commanders were already positioning themselves, forming alliances, making promises they couldn't keep. Washington and Tel Aviv didn't create this instability. They simply watched it develop, catalogued every fault line, mapped every rivalry, then they struck the match. This is the Machiavellian calculation in its purest form. You don't need to topple a regime when you can accelerate its collapse. You don't need boots on the ground when internal factions will tear each other apart fighting for the throne. The horror isn't just in the act itself, it's in the cold mathematics behind it. Intelligence agencies spent years identifying exactly which fractures to exploit, exactly which moment would cause maximum chaos. Khamenei's death didn't destabilize Iran. It detonated instabilities that already existed beneath the surface. Rivalries between hardliners and pragmatists, generational divides within the Revolutionary Guard, economic grievances that leadership had suppressed for decades, one strike, decades of pressure released, and now everyone scrambles to fill the void. The announcement hadn't even finished echoing through newsrooms before the real winners started counting their profits. Lockheed Martin, Raytheon, Northrop Grumman. Within 72 hours, defense stocks climbed by billions in combined market value. Investors weren't mourning, they were celebrating. Here's what they understand that most people don't. Peace is bad for business. Stability in the Middle East represents an existential threat to quarterly earnings. Every crisis, every power vacuum, every threat of regional war translates directly into government contracts worth tens of billions of dollars. The numbers are staggering. The United States has sold over $300 billion in weapons to Middle Eastern nations since 2010. Saudi Arabia alone signed a $100 billion arms deal. Israel receives nearly $4 billion annually in military aid, most of which flows straight back to American defense contractors. Khamenei's death doesn't create uncertainty for these corporations. It creates opportunity. A succession crisis in Tehran means Gulf states stockpiling weapons. It means Israel demanding more interceptors. It means congressional approval for emergency defense spending. The chaos isn't a side effect of their business model. The chaos is the business model, and someone just handed them their most profitable quarter in years. The second winner sits in Tel Aviv watching decades of strategic patience finally pay off. For years, Israel has faced a coordinated threat network stretching from Tehran through Damascus to Beirut. Hezbollah's arsenal, estimated at over 150,000 rockets, has kept northern Israeli communities living under constant shadow. Iranian generals have openly directed operations from Syrian soil. Now, that command structure fractures. Hezbollah doesn't just lose funding, it loses strategic direction. The sophisticated coordination between Iranian Revolutionary Guards and Lebanese militants requires constant communication, planning, intelligence sharing. Without Khamenei's unifying authority, that network fragments into competing factions. Syria's Assad regime, already weakened, loses its most reliable external supporter. The vacuum creates opportunities Israeli military planners have studied for years. Look at the Golan Heights. Israeli settlements have expanded steadily, but international pressure and Iranian-backed resistance limited ambitions. With Tehran consumed by internal power struggles, that resistance evaporates. Defense officials in Jerusalem aren't mourning, they're redrawing maps. Buffer zones expand. Settlement boundaries push outward. Decades of territorial goals suddenly become achievable in months. Iran's loss is Israel's strategic windfall. Iran now faces an impossible choice, and that's exactly how it was designed. If the regime retaliates, if missiles fly toward Tel Aviv or American bases in Iraq, every Western headline writes itself. Iran proves it's the aggressor. The threat was real all along. Suddenly, years of diplomatic isolation feel justified, sanctions tighten. Military options that seemed extreme yesterday become reasonable tomorrow. But here's the trap within the trap. If Iran does nothing, if the supreme leader's death goes unanswered, the regime looks weak. Not to Washington or Jerusalem, but to its own people. To the Revolutionary Guard commanders who've built careers on resistance. To the proxy networks watching from Lebanon and Yemen. To the millions of Iranians who've suffered under sanctions, told their sacrifice served a greater purpose. A regime that cannot avenge its highest leader is a regime that cannot protect anyone. Strike back, you justify your own destruction. Stay quiet, you accelerate your internal collapse. This is the strategic vice. And the architects of this moment understood something crucial. They didn't need to invade Iran. They just needed to make Iran destroy itself. The most dangerous beneficiary isn't in Washington, Jerusalem, or Riyadh. They're in Tehran itself. For years, reformist and pragmatic factions within Iran's own establishment have been systematically crushed, sidelined, pushed into political exile. Presidents who sought dialogue with the West found their initiatives sabotaged. Moderates watched as hardliners consolidated every lever of power. But here's what nobody discusses openly. Some of these internal players may have quietly welcomed Khamenei's removal. Not through active conspiracy, but through calculated inaction. Intelligence warnings that arrived too slowly, security protocols that weren't quite followed. The subtle art of looking the other way. Men like former President Hassan Rouhani's allies, technocrats tired of isolation, military commanders exhausted by endless regional conflicts draining Iran's treasury. They understood something crucial. As long as Khamenei lived, fundamental change remained impossible. His death doesn't guarantee reform. The IRGC remains powerful. Hardliners control key institutions, but for the first time in decades the door cracked open. And in Iranian politics, sometimes a crack is all you need. The question becomes, who positioned themselves closest to that door? The supreme leader's greatest failure was never naming a successor. And Washington knew it. 3 factions now circle each other like wolves. Mojtaba Khamenei, the Thijsan, controls the intelligence apparatus. He's spent 2 decades positioning himself, purging rivals, building loyalty networks inside the Revolutionary Guard. But he lacks religious credentials. The clerics despise him. Then there's the IRGC brass. Generals who command actual armies, actual missiles, actual money. They've watched the Khamenei family accumulate billions while soldiers died in Syria. They want one of their own. And caught between them, the assembly of experts. 88 elderly clerics who technically choose the next supreme leader. Most are compromised, most are terrified. American intelligence didn't just track these divisions, they weaponized them. Every leaked document, every suspicious death, every rumor planted in Tehran's back channels over the past 18 months was designed to deepen these fractures. The regime's survival always depended on one thing, Khamenei's ability to balance these competing powers. Remove him, and the balance collapses. Israel provided the capability. America provided the chaos. The axis of resistance was never really an axis at all. It was a web, and Khamenei sat at its center, spinning the threads that connected Hezbollah to Hamas, the Houthis to Iraqi militias. Now that center is gone, and the web is unraveling faster than anyone predicted. In Lebanon, Hezbollah faces an impossible choice: double down on Iran's mission or pivot toward Lebanese politics to survive. Their coffers are running dry. In Syria, militias that once answered to Tehran are cutting deals with whoever offers protection. Some are already negotiating with Turkish intermediaries. Others have simply melted away. Iraq's popular mobilization forces are fracturing along tribal lines, old loyalties resurfacing now that the unifying paymaster has fallen silent. And in Yemen, the Houthis are discovering that revolutionary fervor doesn't replace Revolutionary Guard funding. Each group is making the same cold calculation. Solidarity was profitable when Iran was strong. Now it's a liability. The ideological glue that held this network together for decades is dissolving, replaced by something far more dangerous and unpredictable: pure self-interest. The Roman senators who celebrated Parthia's succession crisis believed they were witnessing an empire's death. They were wrong. Parthia survived. It stabilized. But it emerged as something fundamentally different: more decentralized, more willing to negotiate, more focused on survival than expansion. Iran stands at that same threshold. The Islamic Republic won't collapse overnight. The Revolutionary Guards won't simply dissolve, but the theological certainty that drove 45 years of confrontation, that dies with Khamenei, what replaces it will be messier, more corrupt, more pragmatic, a system held together by money and power rather than divine mandate. And paradoxically, that's exactly what Western diplomats have been waiting for. You cannot negotiate with true believers, but you can negotiate with men protecting their bank accounts, their families, their legacies. The transformation won't be pretty, it won't be quick. Millions of Iranians will suffer through the uncertainty, but on the other side lies something that hasn't existed since 1979, an Iranian government that sees compromise not as betrayal, but as strategy. Here's the uncomfortable truth no one wants to say out loud. This wasn't justice. Justice has trials, evidence, accountability. This was geopolitics with a body count. The same Western powers that overthrew Iran's democracy in 1953, that armed Saddam Hussein in the 1980s, that sanctioned Iranian civilians for decades. They just executed a head of state and called it progress, and maybe Khamenei deserved it. Maybe the world is genuinely better without him. But that's not the point. The point is who decides. Who gave anyone the authority to redraw the Middle East through assassination? Because the last time someone tried that, killing Soleimani, Iran responded by raining missiles on American bases. So ask yourself this: is stability built on targeted killings actually stability? Or is it just a pause between explosions? Every action creates reaction. Every intervention plants seeds for the next generation of grievances, the next supreme leader, the next enemy we'll be told we need to eliminate. We've been here before. We'll be here again. The only question is whether we'll recognize the cycle, or just keep celebrating each new killing as victory. On March 1st, 2026, American missiles didn't just end a life. They placed a bet that chaos can be controlled, that power vacuums can be filled with friendly faces. That 70 years of strategic miscalculation in the Middle East somehow ends differently this time. The IRGC is already choosing sides. Tehran's streets run with the blood of protesters and loyalists alike. And somewhere in the shadows, the next supreme leader is making promises he'll spend decades keeping. Washington calls this a victory. Tel Aviv celebrates in the streets. But the families in Beirut, in Baghdad, in villages whose names will never make the evening news, they're not celebrating. They're preparing. Because if history teaches us anything, it's this: the architects of decapitation never pay the price. McNamara died in his bed. Kissinger collected awards. Cheney writes memoirs. Their children don't patrol the checkpoints. Their grandchildren won't inherit the blowback. So the real question was never whether Khamenei deserved his fate. It's this: what monster rises from the chaos tomorrow? And who will still be paying for today's bet 50 years from now?